Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first meeting of the ABS Book Club. We have been reading Dr. David Schulenberg's biography of Bach this fall. We are excited to have him with us today. Dr. Schulenberg, as some of you may have read about, is professor of music history at Wagner College. He has written extensively about Baroque music, and he is a performer on historical keyboard instruments, which is something you will get to experience today, which is a special treat for us. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Carrie. And before I start, I want to thank you and the American Bach Society for this book club, which is something new for us, and it's really a treat to be the first person, the first book author to be speaking with the club. Um, I've been, working on Bach my whole life, but this is something new, and I hope this will be successful, and I hope it will continue.
Yeah, well, you were a wonderful start for us. I was going to say guinea pig again, but that sounds a bit tacky. So, I think today we want to hear a little bit more from you about the process of researching the book, just maybe a bit about that. And then I think most of what we're going to talk about today are the major concepts and themes from the book. And then we will have you answer a couple of reader questions from book club members. A couple of those questions are woven throughout the conversation, and then we've got one or two for you at the end. So let's jump in with talking about the backstory and the research process behind the book. Just briefly, tell us a little bit about your research and writing process.
Well, for someone like myself who's been working on Bach literally my entire adult life, writing another book about Bach is not a self-contained process. So, as some of you know, I've written an earlier book on Bach's keyboard music. I've edited his music. I've performed it. And so all of those previous experiences work their way into the work on this particular book. But despite all the work I've done on Bach, it never really occurred to me to write a biography until I was asked to do so by Oxford University Press back in 2016. And honestly, writing about Bach's life didn't strike me as terribly interesting, and we already had good biographies by Malcolm Boyd and Christoph Wolff, among others. Also in 2016, the late Peter Williams published the third version of his life and works of Bach, which he called a musical biography. And it just didn't seem necessary for me to add to the Bach bibliography. But Oxford specifically wanted to replace Malcolm Boyd's book in their Master Musicians series. That series went back more than 100 years. The first Bach book in the series came out in 1900. And today that series title, Master Musicians, has become politically incorrect. And Oxford has renamed the series Composers Across Cultures. Now, that new series title, which came out after I wrote the book, seems to reflect the preoccupation of many musicologists today with culture and society as opposed to individual composers and their music. And yet, I think most of us become interested in Bach because of his music. Now, that said, and that's certainly true for me, but that said, I am also interested in general history and culture and society. So, as I thought about Oxford's request, I realized that maybe I could make a contribution to how we understand Bach and his music within the context of 18th century European culture and society. Now, the problem with writing any biography of Bach is that his life on the whole just isn't very interesting.
Mm.
For me, the most interesting thing in the life of a musician is their music. And yet, a biographer of Bach has to explain things like how he went from one job to another. You need to discuss his two marriages and his many children. There are a few entertaining stories that every biographer has to mention, but there weren't many truly dramatic events in his life. So my original idea was to summarize his life in a single introductory chapter and then move on to his music. Well, when I made this proposal to Oxford, they thought it was a terrible idea. So I went back to the drawing board and I took the more conventional plan of alternating between chapters on the life and chapters on the works. And In fact, the biographical chapters wound up including a lot about Bach's material surroundings, such as the geography of where he grew up, and also the people whom he knew and worked with. In the chapters on music, I didn't just write about compositions, I tried to write about how these compositions fit into his work as an organist and later in life as a city music director. Now, I got to say, Carrie, when I started writing, I thought I knew a lot about Bach's life and works. But scholars have studied Bach so thoroughly that a conscientious biographer has to look into all sorts of details about things that might seem unimportant, but they've exercised earlier writers. So, for instance, I had to reread all the evidence for and against Bach's having performed the B minor Mass at Dresden in 1733.
Right.
I had to slog through these old Nazi-era writings about Bach's family, and these were not only about his ancestors, but those of his two wives. And a lot of this stuff never made it into the book, but it did open up windows on his life that I hadn't previously looked into.
That's a great peek behind the scenes. And, you touched on something that your book reminds us of quite often, which is that in Bach's case, we often do not have enough information to make conclusive statements, either about his life or about certain works, but at times we can make informed guesses. How did you handle this uncertainty?
That's a central question. And I think the most important thing in any sort of scholarship or research is to recognize when we don't know something. So we have relatively little hard data about Bach. So a lot of biographers have filled gaps in our knowledge through speculation or by drawing inferences. So I mentioned the problem with the B minor Mass. You can read that Bach performed that music around the time he submitted his application to the royal court at Dresden. But this is sheer assertion. It's based on plausible but unprovable assumptions. So my preference has been to point out when we don't know something, or when a supposed fact really is just a hypothesis. And I know this can be frustrating for readers, but we can't go back in time to figure out when Bach wrote his first cantata or to ask him how he felt when one of his children died. It's better to know what we don't know rather than pretend to know we know something that might not be true. And so that leaves Bach a mystery in a lot of ways, but we have his music and we have to keep remembering that that is what counts.
Speaking of things that we do know, which fortunately is quite a great deal, let's talk about your online supplement, which is really useful and helpful and obviously just represented an enormous amount of work. Tell us about that.
Well, Carrie, thanks for bringing that up, and I'm glad that you found the supplement useful. There are actually two supplements. One is on the publisher's website, and that includes some supplementary material such as a glossary and audio versions of the music examples in the book. But there's a much bigger supplement on my own website, which maybe I should explain a little bit. When I was first asked to contribute to the series, I looked at Oxford's other books about so-called master musicians. And some of these, such as Donald Burroughs' book on Handel, are big volumes that covered most, if not all, of the scholarly controversies about their subjects. So I set out to do the same, only to discover that Oxford was now looking for smaller, more manageable books. And so we explored the possibility of putting parts of my book on Oxford's website, but that still would have required the publisher to make a pretty big investment in editing and web page design and so forth. And so in the current climate, it's very difficult for publishers to commit to big projects. And I have to say, Oxford did recently publish George Stauffer's big book on Bach's organ music, and I strongly recommend that to anyone interested in the subject. But my book was meant to serve a different purpose, and so I wound up removing most of the detailed treatment of individual compositions and these various biographical problems, which honestly aren't necessarily very important. They just happen to fascinate me and a few other scholars. So I've put that material on my own website. It's free to anybody who wants to read about, for example, Ruth Tatlow's theory of proportional parallelism, or if you want a week-by-week discussion of how Bach went about composing his Leipzig cantatas. So that's free on my website, stuff that didn't get into the book.
Thanks for that. That's an interesting overview, and that sort of takes us through a little bit of the behind the scenes of how the book was put into production, how it came into being. I kind of want to spend, I think, the rest of our time, most of the rest of our time, talking about some of the big ideas in the book, some of the major concepts and themes. Did you want to start off by sort of giving us an overview of what you would consider to be some of the central themes of the book?
Sure. I mean, I didn't set out with any themes or concepts in mind. I just wanted to write a usable biography and useful discussion of the music. And as I said, I tried not to speculate. But you can't entirely avoid speculation when you write about Bach. Probably not about anybody, but especially not about Bach. So, especially as I worked on the biographical parts of the book, I started to find that earlier writers may have overlooked or downplayed certain aspects of his life and even his personality. Bach lived in a culture that was profoundly hierarchical, and yet one in which members of his social class were constantly striving to raise their status. So, one theme of the book turned out to be how Bach allied himself whenever possible with influential people and members of the aristocracy. And he did this to raise not only his own social standing, but that of his family. He and two of his sons became royal musicians, and he seems to have considered himself the equal of the church officials and pastors with whom he worked. Now remember, Bach lived in a theocratic society, and in that sort of a society, these high-ranking ministers played very important roles. I concluded that Bach identified with them and that he also held rather conservative views of both Lutheranism and education. And his religious convictions didn't prevent him from pursuing a career as a virtuoso performer. But he was probably even more conservative and certainly more headstrong than some of those churchmen with whom he worked. And this seems to have constantly gotten him into trouble with higher authorities. This also probably made him a difficult, if not an unpleasant personality. His constant striving and the friction that he had with other people may also, I think, have contributed to the inconsistent nature of his work as a composer. Over his career, periods of intense creativity would be followed by periods of relative inactivity. And it's tempting to imagine that these fallow years were the products of stress or depression. I chose not to speculate in that manner, however, because another theme of the book is that so much about Bach is a mystery, and we'll simply never be able to answer some of the most important questions about him.
Um, I want to hit on some other kind of concepts, central ideas that stood out to me. So this is my second time reading the book. And these were some of the things that really jumped out to me in high relief, and I wanted to hit on some of those and get your thoughts on those beyond what's in the book. Um, I want to talk first about Bach's synthesis of archaic and innovative materials in his works. And I think after rereading your book, this stood out to me as maybe the defining feature of his work that I probably did not grasp earlier in my life as a keyboard player myself. Did his contemporaries perceive this synthesis in his music? Would you say this synthesis is more readily heard in certain categories of his works than others? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And, the old and the new, Bach was seen in his own time as old fashioned. And I think that view has predominated since then. But I'm not sure that we've fully understood what that meant, even within the context of his own time. Because during Bach's lifetime, composers, at least German composers like himself, understood that there were different styles of music. You could write in a different style, you could play in various styles. And the so-called older style, the stile antico, was one of those styles. Everyone understood that this was the style of Palestrina. It was the style of this long dead Italian composer from what we call the late Renaissance. But at the same time, it was a living style. It was a style that people were still using. And so when Bach, for example, writes in that style, as he does fairly frequently, he makes it his own. I think anyone at the time would have recognized, yes, Bach is doing what many of us also do, which is to write in the so-called Palestrina style. On the other hand, when he also wrote, and the Palestrina style, I should say, is contrapuntal, it's polyphonic. You have multiple voices singing independent melodic lines. That was fine as long as you did it in the Palestrina style. When you did it in arias, when you did it in choruses that were not in the Palestrina style, when you did it in the dance movements of a suite, that was not what people normally did during Bach's lifetime. And that's, I think, what got him into trouble with contemporaries who were looking for music that was distinctly not in the Palestrina style. Now, of course, Bach's jigs and other dances don't sound at all like Palestrina. And yet they do have some of that same contrapuntal structure. And at least two of his jigs, the jig in the first French suite and the jig at the end of the sixth partita, are actually written in rather archaic forms. They're in duple time instead of triple meter, for example. And these very intentionally look back at older styles of contrapuntal jig. So I think it's very true that Bach did this all the time, mixing old and new, but doing it in a way that his contemporaries didn't. And just like with his personal relations with some of his superiors, I think this rubbed many contemporaries the wrong way. When they played a dance suite, they didn't want to bother with complicated counterpoint. And for that matter, when they sang in the Palestrina style, they didn't want to hear a lot of chromatic harmony or remote modulations.
His habit of synthesis, if we could call it that, seems to connected to his interest in old music and that quote unquote old music. And it seems, I believe, if I'm remembering something you said in your book correctly, that this interest may have grown near the end of his life. Can you say more about this?
Yeah, again, remember, as I said, that the stile antico, the old style, the Palestrina style, was something that he would have known and not and practiced throughout his career. But at a certain point, he seems to have become more interested in actually using that music, not just studying it. We know that already in the Weimar years, roughly around 1715, he was already gathering together compositions by Palestrina. But we don't have a lot of evidence that he performed it. Later, though, at Leipzig, after he's finished composing most of his cantatas for the Leipzig churches, he seems to start getting more serious about performing old Latin church music in the Palestrina style. And he starts writing in that style himself, not only in movements from, say, the B minor Mass, but also in his instrumental works as well. But as I said earlier, when he does this, he doesn't write in the pure stile antico. And that was, by the way, the topic long ago of Christoph Wolff's dissertation in 1968. When he drew a distinction between the genuine imitation of this Palestrina style and Bach's way of writing in it. So, for instance, in the B minor Mass, the second Kyrie, that is the third movement of the B minor Mass, is in the Palestrina style. It's notated in cut time, for example, but with 4 half notes to the measure. And that was one of the visual signals that, yes, this piece of music is going to be in the Palestrina style. We start with the bass voice singing a fugue subject. And then the tenor voice comes in and imitates that. So that's an example of how the Palestrina style works. Rather austere, plain melodic lines, imitative polyphony. There are no independent instrumental parts in the second Kyrie. But listen to that theme. F sharp, G natural, E sharp, F sharp. That is not part of the Palestrina style. And Palestrina never wrote that way. Neither did virtually any other composer in the 16th through the 18th century writing in this so-called stile antico. Despite this, very chromatic opening, however, this movement has a modern tonal design. By that I mean that it modulates through a series of related keys. And this also was something that you don't find in the true stile antico. Real modulations, real changes of key don't occur typically in music before the 18th century. Bach then, when he imitates this early style, nevertheless integrates it into a modern tonal design. So this piece modulates from F sharp minor to B minor to D major, and it does this in a very deliberate, organized way. And so this is an example again of Bach combining the old and the new. Even while he's ostensibly imitating an old style, he's planning the composition along the same lines as pieces that sound a lot more up to date.
Thanks for that. That's fantastic. Um, Another big kind of current in music making of the time that your book discusses quite a bit is how the expectations for instrumental performance changed during Bach's lifetime, that they trended towards the virtuosic and the idiomatic. Can we hear this trend consistently across maybe most or much of his instrumental writing, or would you say we hear it primarily in his writing for specific instruments? And here I'm thinking of the violin, the keyboard, maybe especially in the solo works.
You know, I think, Harry, it might be more accurate to say that all of Bach's music is virtuosic. I'm thinking, for example, of one of the first cantatas he wrote after he got to Leipzig, and I forget the number, but it opens, I think, with an extraordinarily virtuosic tenor aria.
Mm.
And in fact, throughout his first 2 years at Leipzig, Bach writes a lot of these arias. He must have had a really fine tenor whom he could count on. His vocal writing is just as virtuosic as is his writing for instruments. But even his parts for the viola, although they're not virtuosic in the sense of being display, here's what I can do on the instrument, nevertheless, he never treats the viola as a filler instrument. The alto parts of his choruses, the alto voice isn't just filling in the harmony. You always have interesting and original and expressive details to perform, and it's usually not very easy to do that. Even when the music isn't requiring you to use special virtuoso techniques, it nevertheless might require you to negotiate unusual intervals. And you need to, of course, listen to what the other instruments and voices are doing, and you can't get lost in dealing with your own part, which is a difficult thing to do for a musician. So the difficulties in his music arise less from idiomatic tricks than from the counterpoint and the complex harmony. I think the solo violin pieces, though, are, of course, the best examples of this. But, what makes them difficult? They don't contain the acrobatics that Paganini would call for in the 19th century. And, we find comparable things in music by Locatelli and other contemporaries of Bach, crazy use of double stops and going way up into the stratosphere, high up on the instrument. Bach never writes for violin above fifth position, an octave above the A, 2 octaves above the A string. So he doesn't write the type of obviously virtuoso music that others did. But in the violin solos, the player has to execute 3 lines of a fugue or chromatic chord progressions. In his organ music, the 2 hands have to manage 3 or 4 independent lines while the feet play 1 or 2 more. And this is a little like juggling a couple of basketballs while you're riding a bicycle. But the thing is, you have to play those simultaneous melodic lines without giving the impression that they are hard to play or to coordinate.
Speaking of instrumental virtuosity, I think Bach's keyboard works give us some window into the kind of keyboardist that he himself may have been. Could we say that his writing for violin, as you were just speaking of, can we say that it tells us anything about him as a violinist?
Yeah, probably. But let's remember that Bach's father was a town musician. This meant that Ambrosius Bach was expected to play all of the common instruments then in use. And he would have taught the same to his sons, although Ambrosius died before Sebastian was old enough to have gotten very far on any instrument. Still, Bach probably grew up expecting to play violin or viola in court ensembles, and he probably learned at least the rudiments of playing other instruments. We know that he later in life could lead an ensemble as violinist. So he probably could play anything that he wrote for the violin in his concertos and cantatas. Now, how well he could play the music for unaccompanied violin is anybody's guess. We just don't know. But he certainly played the instrument well enough to understand the demands that he was making on violinists. He also would have understood in detail the performance practices that his compositions require. And we might take that for granted, but today, when student composers start to write, they can use Finale and other software that allows them to play the music on their computers. They don't get a lot of practical experience with instruments or the voice other than their own. Bach had to learn all of that himself with real instruments and real voices. And so he would have known, for example, that the very first chord of the first violin sonata, it's a G minor chord. Well, today you hear that played like this. That's the way a modern violinist plays it. You play the two lower notes and then the two upper ones. You do those as separate double stops. But Bach would have known that in his day, you start the chord with one note on the bottom and then you move up to the top. It's a very different approach to chord playing, and that in turn is going to mean a very different approach to the entire unaccompanied violin solos by Bach, different from the way people play them today. So as a violinist, he would not have resembled the violinists that we hear now playing on modern instruments. How closely so-called Baroque violinists come to Bach's way of playing, we can't be sure, but they're certainly going to be closer.
I want to talk just briefly about the huge subject of improvisation, especially as it intersected with notated music and Bach's work. You make the point in the book that the printed notation of his organ works in particular may not have reflected what he or other organists were playing in church or other settings, but rather, quote, ideal improvisations that served as the basis for real ones, end quote. I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more of this about this?
Sure. When we talk about improvisation, I think we need to be clear about what we really mean. Even jazz isn't wholly improvised. Most jazz songs have a chart, and players and singers have at least a general idea of how each performance is going to go. Good jazz never sounds slapped together. I did write that Bach's compositions for organ and harpsichord seem to be idealized improvisations, but that doesn't mean unplanned or completely spontaneous. In fact, Bach and his contemporaries probably expected that improvisations should sound as if they were written down. When his pupils improvised accompaniments for other musicians, that is, when they were playing basso continuo, Bach probably expected them to add full harmony, but his son Emanuel Bach, explained how to do this while also following the rules of counterpoint. Now, some of Bach's early organ preludes, like those of his predecessors, they do contain passages that seem unpredictable or improvisatory in the usual sense. But this type of playing seems to have gone out of fashion during Bach's lifetime, at least in Germany. It's true that organists during Bach's time were expected to be able to improvise chorale variations and even fugues. But I'm not sure that these things sounded improvisatory as we understand the term. A lot of what we call improvisation actually consists of formulas that have been memorized. And I imagine also that preludes or interludes improvised during a church service might have been quiet and contemplative, filling in gaps in the service with rather innocuous and certainly not terribly original sounds.
Hmm.
But we just don't know.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Speaking of what we do and don't know, a lot of Bach's compositional processes remain fairly opaque to us. That's something that your book is very clear about. But we do know, above all things, that he was a reviser. Um, Massive topic. Want to ask a couple questions about that. First, would you say that he was typical in this regard compared to his peers, his penchant for revision? How did that line up with his contemporaries?
Well, let me start by saying that for Bach's first biographer, that was Forkel, The composer's tendency to revise his works was so exceptional that Forkel devoted an entire chapter to that subject. But I don't know how unusual this really was. Revivals of operas had to be revised to suit new singers. Telemann revised at least one complete annual cycle of his church cantatas. Composers like Vivaldi and Couperin, they undoubtedly revised compositions that they published, but most of their pieces don't survive in their original form, so we don't really know how extensively those pieces were reworked. Now, Bach might have been unusual in the degree to which he continually polished his keyboard pieces, such as the suites and the well-tempered clavier. But one general feature of Baroque music is that it can be ornamented or embellished almost indefinitely. Most composers at the time left that sort of elaboration to performers. Bach tended to write out those elaborations. And this is one way in which he frequently revised his instrumental compositions. He was basically embellishing them, the sorts of things that he might also have done without writing them down. But he didn't devote the same attention to his vocal music. He didn't write ornaments in, for example, after the first draft was written and the first performance took place. The only time he really revised his vocal works was when he had to create new versions of them for different occasions. I think what really set Bach apart from his contemporaries was the extraordinary labor that went into his first drafts. And these are usually more complex. They contain just more lines of music. They contain more notes than those of anybody else at the time. For example, a composer of Italian opera, even Handel, typically wrote just 2 or 3 lines of music, even in full orchestral numbers. Any woodwinds usually just doubled the strings. And as I previously mentioned, the viola just had a filler part. Bach almost never did that. Even a simple aria might involve a 4-part string ensemble and several independent wind parts. And having put so much work into each composition, Bach would reuse it, I think, whenever possible. And then he might revise it more or less thoroughly. In other words, he didn't revise his vocal music habitually, but when he did have an opportunity to reuse a vocal work, he did. And that might mean having a new text written for it, adopting the music to that new text. But I just don't know how extraordinary that really was. Handel, Hasse, and other contemporaries certainly did the same thing when they repeated operas and cantatas.
Hmm. Connected to this impulse towards revision, I think, was Bach's habit of creating collections, something you talk about in your book, collections of 6 or 12 pieces, or sometimes multiples thereof. Where did this idea come from? How did Bach respond to it or expand on it?
Yeah. Well, early Baroque collections, back, say, in the 1620s, 100 years before Bach, these tended to be fairly random collections of compositions of different types. You might get some vocal movements mixed in with a few sonatas, and the sonatas might be a few for 2 instruments, a few for 3, a few for 4. But by the end of the 17th century, it was either composers or publishers or the public. They seemed to have preferred more homogeneous, more rationally organized sets of pieces. So Corelli, for example, beginning in 1681, Corelli published his sonatas and concertos in sets of 12. And that became a pretty standard practice right through the 18th century. Now, Bach followed this pattern even for collections that remained in manuscript. So we have the 6 French suites, the 6 English suites, the well-tempered clavier, which of course contains 2 books of 24 pieces each. That was occasioned perhaps by the fact that there are 24 possible keys. That's a nice coincidence, and it might have seemed significant to Bach because he does seem to have enjoyed playing with numbers. And some of his compositions fall into sections whose durations seem to have been precisely predetermined. So in a lot of cases, the first and second halves of a dance movement are exactly the same length. The final movement of the Third Brandenburg Concerto opens and closes with sections of precisely 12 measures, and there are 24 measures in between. So I previously mentioned Ruth Tatlow, and she finds that not only individual pieces, but Bach's collections of pieces are often governed by what she calls proportional parallelism. Now, Ruth's findings have been disputed, but I don't think there can be any question that Bach went beyond simple convention at the time. He would lay out certain compositions and maybe even collections according to geometric or arithmetic configurations.
I want to stay with this idea of Bach responding to inherited models or to ideas that came before him. It's interesting from our vantage point to look back and realize that some of the Baroque genre conventions that we take for granted were actually codified by Bach. We take them for granted because of what he did with them. Um, can you talk about this as it relates to the idea, for example, of the fugue as a standalone movement or work? That's an idea that comes to us from Bach. Or if you want to, you could take it in the direction of talking about the idea of the stylized dance suite. Whichever way you want to take that.
Well, you mentioned fugue, and very often we don't just say fugue, we say Bach fugue.
Yeah.
The same thing with chorales, right? The hymns of the Lutheran Church. We talk about Bach chorales, and
Yep.
in both cases we mean a specific type of fugue or chorale that we associate with Bach. But Bach is so powerful a musical personality that when we think of chorales, we tend to think of Bach chorales. Um, so let's look at fugues for a little bit. The Latin word fuga means flight in the sense of being chased, and it refers to the idea that one voice or instrument has a melody which is then followed or chased by another. Now, Bach and other musicians of his time knew Latin, and they would have been aware of this meaning of the word. But when Marburg, who knew Bach, published a book on fugue in the 1750s, of course, he was writing about fugues as we understand the term, but he was also writing about fugue in this more abstract or general way. So the word fugue for Bach and his contemporaries could mean a specific piece, but it was also a process, just a way of writing music. The art of fugue is about imitative counterpoint generally, and in fact, some of the pieces in the art of fugue really aren't fugues at all, as we understand the term. They're not even Bach fugues. On the other hand, even in his youth, Bach did use the word fugue to refer to individual pieces. And we find this title used for individual compositions by Buxtehude and other earlier composers, and some of these are substantial pieces comparable in size and seriousness to Bach's own. So I wouldn't say that Bach really invented the fugue as we understand it, and yet our idea of a prelude and fugue, or just a fugue, is largely the product of Bach's having written so many of these pieces for organ or for harpsichord, or for that matter, writing choruses that are in the form of a prelude and fugue. With Bach, both the prelude and the fugue are substantial pieces. They're not just 12 or 24 measures. That, by the way, is the case with earlier such works. For example, the composer Fischer published a set of preludes and fugues in 1702. Fischer's preludes and fugues look like miniatures, but they probably are closer to what that expression prelude and fugue meant to Bach when he was a young man. So he's expanding this terminology. For him, a fugue becomes a big, serious piece of music. It isn't just a process, although he also understood the word that way as well.
Mhm. Um, Kind of continuing to think in terms of how Bach expands or even wrestles with musical currents of his time. Another kind of feature of his work in that direction was how he would stretch tonality. I think you may have even used the term stretch in the book. We hear it, you point out, in a very striking way in the Weimar organ fantasias, for example. Where else in Bach's output do we hear these kinds of remote modulations within a tonal framework? And would you say that his peers were also similarly exploring remote modulations, or is this kind of a Bach thing?
The idea of modulating rapidly between remote keys, I don't think this was new or unusual during Bach's lifetime. Again, if we need to sort of expand our horizon of pieces a little bit. Think of recitative, for example. Recitatives by Handel and other contemporaries can also modulate swiftly and surprisingly. I think what distinguishes Bach's modulations is that they usually occur within much grander and also much more carefully integrated formal structures. It's difficult to talk about this without getting very technical, but you mentioned the Weimar organ fantasias. And I think what you have in mind is the fantasia in G minor, which I discuss in the book. This is an extraordinary piece, yet it's fundamentally in the same binary or bipartite form as other less adventurous compositions. Now, even in his early years, Bach seems to have been fascinated by remote modulations, but always within a clearly grounded larger form. In a very early overture for harpsichord, for example, there's a long episode that moves through an astounding series of keys. Let me just play this passage for you. We start in E flat. We're going to move to G flat major. And this is in a piece in G minor. So we've gone from E flat to G flat, and now he's got to get back to G minor, which he does by sort of reversing what he just did and moving back to E flat. So the important point here is that even as a young man, Bach is playing with remote modulations, but he's doing it within the context of a very clear tonal plan. This is what I call tonal design. In the Art of Fugue, one of Bach's last works, he's still thinking this way. The main theme of the Art of Fugue, of course, is very firmly in D minor. Starts with a D minor triad. But at the end of the number 11, this is the four-part triple fugue. We hear all sorts of extraordinary modulations, in part because the other subjects of this fugue are highly chromatic. One of those subjects is based on the letters of Bach's name. So we have that subject together with the D minor subject. And at the very end of this piece, just 4 measures before the end, we have a cadence in B flat. But we have to get back to D. And he does it very ingeniously and very smoothly. Let me play this from about 8 measures before the end. No, I'm sorry, let me start that again. B flat major. So because he's got these highly chromatic second and third subjects, this fugue goes through all sorts of remote modulations. Other composers occasionally did write fugues with highly chromatic subjects, but they never sort of realized the implications of those chromatic subjects by moving to so many different keys, and also by doing those modulations so beautifully, integrating them into a large monumental design.
Thanks for that. The last kind of big concept or theme that jumped out on my rereading of your book is the idea of Bach as teacher, which is the role that you explore in the last chapter. And I appreciated that chapter's focus on this. And what I liked is that you explored the idea of him as a teacher, not just in a very defined role with specific students, but also in the sense that his work can be thought of broadly as pedagogical, intended as demonstrations or models of specific compositional approaches or techniques. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this way of thinking about Bach's work. And I think what I have in mind here is that is somewhat opposed to later interpretive frameworks that sort of come out of German Romanticism, that might try to understand musical works as autobiographical expressions, forms of personal expression or self-disclosure on the composer's part. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about this idea of Bach's works as pedagogical in orientation.
Yeah, sure. I want to pick up on what you were just saying. This autobiographical type of interpretation, I think it does come out of the Romantic era. During the 19th century, it became customary to imagine that people like Beethoven and Mozart wrote music out of their own feelings to express their own situations, and we've more recently seen writings about Bach that do the same sort of thing. And Bach did a few things in some compositions to sort of invite that type of interpretation. So in the Art of Fugue, those are the letters of his name: B flat, A, C, H. But even when Bach does that, I think it's more like a painter including their name in the design of a painting, and it's nothing more than that. It doesn't have any deeper significance. The 19th century Romantics wanted to read autobiographical references into music, but we just have no evidence that Bach actually thought that way. Now, on the other hand, I think many of Bach's works might be self-referential in the sense that he planned them as exercises for himself, either to build his performance technique or to work out particular problems of composition. And so when we learn or study those pieces, we're replicating Bach's own experience as he set those challenges for himself. Now, to get back to Bach as teacher, and of course, when we relive Bach's experience or imagine we're doing it, we're also being taught by him. But practically any of his compositions are in some sense pedagogic, and I think he did this intentionally. The cantatas, for example, which were not written for his students to study and perform at the keyboard, nevertheless, they were meant to teach people Bible lessons, religious lessons, lessons in how to live. And I think Bach really did think of his music as an essential element of that teaching people in the very literal sense of the word. But I know that's not what you meant, Carrie, when you asked the question. You're thinking more of works like the Well-Tempered Clavier and the Art of Fugue, which were designed for students to puzzle over at the keyboard or just studying the score. And particularly the pieces that I discussed in chapter 13, I think were deliberately assembled to serve as models for students. This includes not only the printed collections of keyboard music, but also the four-part chorale harmonizations. They weren't published until after Bach's death, but it seems pretty clear that he in some way organized them into a study collection. I'm not sure about the Latin masses, since those did serve specific church or liturgical purposes, but even those works, I think, could have functioned as compendia of compositional models. During his later years, Bach was reading Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum. This is the Steps to Parnassus, Fuchs's famous counterpoint textbook. And that textbook includes a number of complete examples of Latin polyphony. And Bach's friend and pupil Mitzler translated the Latin original into German. Bach presumably read this and saw those Latin compositions in there, and probably would have been fired or inspired to write some of his own examples such as that. So Bach, was reading that book presumably because Fuchs was a Kapellmeister like himself, an esteemed contemporary, and Bach made himself a student of Fuchs, at least to the degree that he read the book and learned from it. Bach was, in a sense, a student his entire life. He was constantly learning from music by other composers. He was performing, as I mentioned earlier, these Latin works by composers going back to Palestrina. And I'm sure he did that because he thought the music was worth performing, but he was also learning from it, and his students were learning from it as he did that. So Bach was a teacher and a student at the same time, and his music encourages us to be the same.
Hmm. Um, Kind of going back to this idea of what kind of interpretive lens do we apply to understand or to receive or make meaning out of Bach's music. We got a reader question along these lines that I wanted to share with you, and it pertains to a specific piece of music. Got a question about the chaconne from the second partita for solo violin, and the reader writes, "This piece is filled with it cycles through a number of emotions, or I would say affects." And the question is there any evidence for biographical linkage between the chaconne and specifically the circumstances of Bach's first wife dying? I think Maria Barbara, I think he was away on a trip when she passed, if I recall. Um, can you share your thoughts about that? Any linkage that would be there to support that kind of
Yeah,
evidence?
yeah, sure. Well, first, I want to thank the club member for the question, but I have to say my answer is no.
Yeah.
As you recalled, Maria Barbara died while Bach was touring. Well, not touring, but traveling with his employer at the time, the Prince of Curtin. They came back home, and Bach, according to the early biographies, discovered his wife was dead. He had no idea until he actually came home from this trip. And that would have been a terrible shock, obviously. Um, how did a 19th century musician react to that? Well, maybe they went and wrote a funeral march. An 18th century musician, as far as we know, didn't do that. Um, I think there is one known work. It's by a composer named Stroke. It's a Ritschekar for keyboard, which he supposedly wrote in memory of his mother. Um, Johann Jakob Froberger, another 17th century German composer of keyboard music, wrote quite a few pieces which, according to his own words, these were written to express or represent certain events that happened to him in his life, like being robbed by soldiers. Um, so those are explicitly autobiographical Baroque compositions. But we just have no evidence that Bach ever did that. Um, and I have to say that the specific idea that the chaconne was a response to Maria Barbara's death, that depends on a couple of things. First of all, she did die in July 1720, and Bach's famous manuscript of the violin solos is also dated 1720. Unfortunately, we don't know when in 1720 he completed it. We also, though, can't be sure when he originally composed the music, because the manuscript is a fair copy, meaning that it's a clean copy of music that must have been drafted in an earlier copy that doesn't survive. So it's not impossible that Bach wrote this piece after his wife had died, but it's not particularly likely, I don't think. Secondly, a chaconne is a set of variations on a bass line. So in the piece, we hear this bass line no fewer than 64 times. This is the bass line. We hear that 64 times, and here are the first two statements of that bass line together with the upper voices, the melody and the inner parts. So 64 is one of those special numbers, right? It's a power of two, which Bach must have predetermined before he even started writing this piece. That probably has nothing to do with Maria Barbara, but it's just an example of Bach's planning. But more significantly is the fact that chaconne basses were sometimes used for lamentation, works that were meant to represent a death of some sort, although more typically a very simple descending line. Bach has a somewhat more complicated bass line in this piece. So it's not inconceivable that a chaconne might have been used to represent or express sadness or lamentation. But the chaconne was a French dance, and there were quick, humorous chaconnes as well as stately or solemn ones. So we shouldn't assume that because Bach wrote a big chaconne for the violin, that its primary affect is lamentation. Um, there is, of course, a very famous Bach chaconne that does that, and that's the Crucifixus of the B minor Mass. Um, but this violin chaconne is full of virtuoso writing, and it's the type of writing that a Baroque musician or listener probably would not have associated with mourning or sadness. I think if you were trying to write if a Baroque musician were trying to write music that did express sadness, if you put that type of virtuoso writing in it, it would have seemed terribly out of place. Now, unfortunately, the modern tradition is to play this piece very slowly, and certainly without the energy typical of a French Baroque chaconne. It's easier to play that way, and it can make a very deep impression on listeners when that's done very well. But I think to turn it into a funeral hymn is not at all what Bach's notation would have suggested to his contemporaries. And, finally, even more important, to get back to my original point, I don't think that Baroque composers typically wrote music to express their own feelings. I just don't think it would have occurred to Bach to memorialize his wife or his own feelings about her in a piece of music. We know of one piece by Bach that perhaps does that. That's the famous, very early capriccio on separation from a beloved brother. And that piece even contains a chaconne, which is a lamenting chaconne. The thing is, I don't know how seriously we can take that piece. That chaconne is in the middle of a composition which he calls capriccio, which suggests something less than serious. And there are some very lively, unserious movements surrounding that chaconne. So was Bach really heartbroken over separation from the brother named in the title? Maybe, maybe not. But I just don't think that we can take that example as having anything at all to do with the violin chaconne. So I think it's best not to project stories onto that piece or any other instrumental music by Bach. I think that doing so distracts us from possible alternative interpretations. The chaconne was typically the grandest number in a French ballet or opera, and a single one could, like Bach's, incorporate a great variety of musical ideas representing many, many emotions. And I think that that's what Bach set out to do in this piece, to represent lots of different affects. But in the absence of words or titles, I think it would be a mistake for us to attach specific types of feeling to this music, let alone to attach reflections from Bach's own life.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we want to get just a couple of final big picture reflections from you before we wrap up what for me has been a very enjoyable hour that I think we're all very grateful for. What do you hope that readers take from this book?
Carrie, I'll be happy if the book just encourages readers to listen carefully to a variety of Bach's compositions. Many of us know the keyboard music, but we don't know the vocal music, or we might know a few arias, but we don't know the cantatas that they come from. Just go back, sure, read what I had to say about those pieces, but then go and listen to them. There are so many of these pieces, and they are unfailingly original, yet also expressive. They're challenging. Bach himself set challenging tasks for himself. Sometimes he had to set an uninspiring text to music, but he always came out with something that's unique and worth our listening to. There are many things we won't ever know about him, and yet in his compositions we do hear echoes and reflections of all sorts of music by his contemporaries and his predecessors, but all of this has been digested and adapted through the genius of this one distinctive creative mind.
I have to ask, even though you've done a massive amount of work, you've got a lot behind you. What are you working on now? What's next for you?
Well, I've just finished a book on historical performance practice, mainly on Baroque music. And naturally, Bach takes up an important part of the book, but I've tried to cover a lot more than that. This book honestly, I've intended it to encapsulate a lot of what I've learned in a career of performing and teaching mostly Baroque music. And in fact, that's my title for the book, Mostly Baroque.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, hopefully, if the book club is around in a few years, post book publication, we can have you back.
Well, I certainly hope the book club will be around. Whether the book will actually come out and even be worth your talking about, that's another question.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, David. This has been a real treat for me, and I know for the rest of the book club members.
Thank you, Carrie. I know you put a lot of work into setting this up. I hope it will continue successfully. And thank you to everybody who joined us.
Thanks for that.